Hello fellow shooters, Blowback here again, Airsoft Action's Island Insider here in Taiwan. Today we're going to be taking a look at my KJ Works CZ75 Shadow 2. This is my longest serving gas blowback pistol for use in Action Air, or Airsoft IPSC. This was reviewed in my Reloaded article in Airsoft Action Online magazine, issue 129. If you want to go check it out in written form, that's there for you on the back issues on the website. As I mentioned in my written review, the Shadow 2 was acquired in August 2020 and I've been running it as my primary action air gun since then, so it's basically had a year and a half of intensive usage in training and competitions before the hammer mechanism failed, and I did manage to fracture the outer barrel twice. What the hell? Oh shit. Once about a year ago, and once more recently with the replacement second barrel. So it's now on its third outer barrel. I replaced that recently just before a competition. That's mostly due to CO2 magazine use. Obviously the slide velocity is a lot higher using CO2, and it seems to be a problem for European users, which is why they redesigned the barrel between the two generations. But it still has the same problem. So aside from those failure points, it's been very accurate, reliable, consistent gun, and I've gotten very fast running drills with it. Due to its short and light single action trigger, very useful, basically a pound and a quarter roughly, around about that weight, so very easy on the single action. Obviously in production you need to use double action to start for the first shot with, which I can't do, so I've been kind of winging it and bending the rules in training. So both the SP01 and the Shadow 2 developed the same double action issue. It turns out that the hammer and sear bearing chassis in the back here, it's got two very light prongs which basically break off and fracture during use. So the double action function no longer works properly. So having looked over the exploded diagram of both guns side by side, I realised they're basically identical internally, or at least from this frame downwards. The slide, there's some different geometry obviously, and the sights are different at the back, and the internal gas blowback unit is slightly different as well. But in terms of the lower frame, besides the shape change, all the internal parts are numbered the same and look identical, so the strip down procedure is basically the same for both, apart from the slide. So, in this video, I'll strip it down and go through the wear issues and problems I've encountered as far as we do it. So, first off, no magazine in, lock the waiting parts to the rear, chamber's empty, let the slide go, fire off the action. Now we can start by removing the slide. So again, we use cocked action. At the rear of both the slide and the frame, there are two tick marks, so you need to line them up with each other to get the right positioning. Now, with that held in the slide in the rear position, I usually use my right hand side to push out this little nub here. That releases the slide stop release lever, which holds the whole thing together. So with that gone, you can just pull the top slide off like that. I have large hands, so that's easy for me to do while I'm juggling the rest of it. So you might need to find your own way of doing it more simply. It is a pain in the backside to get back in as well because of an internal spring there that we'll see later. You sometimes have to use a tool to push that out of the way to get the thing back in. So it can be a bit fiddly to disassemble. So, with the slide off, we'll put it to one side, and the slide stop release, don't need that for the moment. Start by taking the frame apart. We'll take the side panel screws off. So these are parts number 54. So unscrew both of them, and then take the left panel, number 30, and the right panel, number 31 off. So. Okay, push that out from inside with your finger. Keep the screws to one side as well. And we do the side, so the right panel. Okay, so screw and the other panel there. So with the side grip panels off, we can start disassembly of the frame. So first, take a look at the top of the sear system here. Inside here, holding the left safety lever in, is a butterfly spring pushing down on it, which is also wrapped around the main pin, part number 56, the sear pin. So That spring is part number 65. It's a bit of a pain to get out. So you need a pointed tool of some sort. I'm using the corkscrew on my Swiss Army knife. You have to get it through this gap and underneath the front leg of that spring to lift it up. So through that gap, you see there, it lifts the leg up out of the way. And with the leg lifted, you can take the left safety, part number 12, left safety lever out. Also important to note, the left safety itself also incorporates two other pieces, parts number 14 and 71 respectively. This sliding unit, which is part of the selector for safe or fire, it retains the safety lever in the position that you select and the spring underneath it. So you can remove the right safety part as well now, part number 110, by rotating it upwards and lifting it out. So you see that matches that cutout there. So when it's in the normal position or the fire or safe position, it's locked, but you turn it vertical and those line up and you can pull it out. So with both safety levers removed, we can now focus on the mainspring unit at the back here. So we use a 2mm punch. You can drift out the bottom pin, part number 55, and the top pin, part number 50. And then the whole spine frame here, part number 5, will drop out. So usually you can just push them out manually. Shouldn't need too much persuasion. So you see it springs forward there because of the spring pressure. So that's part number 50, the top pin. And at the bottom, part number 55, push that out. Okay, part number 55, the bottom retainer pin, and when you release that, the whole thing should come out. So the main body itself is part 5. This whole unit contains parts numbers 86, which is the brass spring tube that holds the spring itself. Part number 73 is the main spring inside there that actually drives the hammer itself. Part number 74 sits on top of that spring, that's the transfer cap, which basically pushes up on the hammer spur there to transfer the action of the spring. Part number 51 in the middle here is the main swinging pin that the striker system swings on. 68 is the butterfly spring inside that retains that and pushes it back. Part number 24 is the main swinger arm here that actually does the actual action. 23 is the striker itself, this flapping bit that bashes into the back of the valve on the magazine to release the gas. And at the very back here is part number 52, the striker transfer bar, the bit that actually gets hit by the hammer and system. And the axle, part number 52 on that. And there's a small butterfly spring underneath that as well to help that return. That's part number 69. If for some reason you need to take the striker, the transfer bar or the striker itself apart, you need to drift out pin number 52, the main axle part that goes through there. Drift that out from the left to the right using a punch. It's quite difficult, so unless you absolutely have to, I'd probably avoid doing it. There's no real need to, but if you do that, obviously also be careful of the return spring here. Butterfly spring, part number 69, that'll spring out as well. So if you don't need to take this apart, I'd avoid doing it, and I don't really need to. So to take the swinging arm unit off the mainspring unit, again, use a 3mm punch. Just push out the main swinging pin, part number 51. Be careful when you do this because this spring here, part number 68, is going to want to fly out. So maybe push your thumb over it, push the pin out. So that's part number 51, the main spring pin, and then release the spring gently so it doesn't fly off somewhere else. Okay, so there's spring part number 68, the internal butterfly spring that actually causes that swinging action. So to finally disassemble part number 5, this whole system here, push part number 86, the main spring tube, out forwards or backwards. Watch that you don't lose the cap here. So this is part number 74, the cap, which is on top of part number 73 spring. So again, push that out into your hands so you can catch any parts that try and fly out. Okay, and there we have it. So part number 86, the main tube for the mainspring, part number 74, the mainspring cap that transfers the spring power into the hammer spur, and part number 73, the mainspring itself. Okay, so that's all disassembled. There's part number 5, the chassis block itself. With the mainspring unit taken at the back, next thing is the axle itself that retains this. So at the back here, there's a retainer pin that's vertically placed inside. That's part number 82. We can push that up out of the way, and we can use pliers to pull it out the rest of the way. So grab that. Okay, part number 82. So that's the retainer pin. With that out, we can then push the main pin itself, axle part number 44, out to the other side. So use a punch to go from the right to the left to push that out. So there we are. You can see there's the cutout there where part number 82 rests into it. So part number 44, pull that out that side. That's the main hammer axle. And with that removed, the whole chassis can be lifted up out. Maybe you need to activate the trigger to help get it out. There we go. This is the chassis that carries all the hammer and sears. You can pull it out vertically, and then we can detail strip this. This is also the part that's broken, so you can see around here one of the ears is missing, so the axle will tend to slew, and instead of actuating double action, it'll just slip. Okay, so those ears break off because they're very thin and fragile. That's the main point, the cause of the problem for the double action issue. So now we can disassemble the whole hammer unit chassis. So first, start off by drifting this big central pin, part number 45, out. One way or the other, so that comes out. Part number 45, the main hammer axle basically. Put that to one side. And of course now the hammer itself will come out. Okay, so there you can see better now as well. This whole leg has broken off, which is why the double action doesn't work anymore. So this is a very fragile and annoying part. It's happened on both my SPO1 and my Shadow 2. And in the new USW A1, they've beefed this part up considerably, so it must have caused problems for a lot of people. So I'm still waiting for replacement parts for that. So to strip down the actual chassis itself, first we need to push out pin number 56, this part here, all the way through. And then we can drop out the sear parts. So pin 56, you can see, is what the butterfly spring we talked about earlier rests upon. So take out that. Part number 65, the butterfly return spring for the rocker arm, and then you can see here as well the sear rocker arm itself. You can push that out. So that's part number 7. So that sits within the chassis and rocks against that spring action, and that's what engages with the notches on the hammer itself to give you half cock and full cock, and then obviously when you pull the trigger it drops. If needs be, the hammer unit itself can be disassembled further, so you need to drift out parts number 49 and number 58, the pins that retain this, which is part number 11, the double action transfer bar for the trigger bar to actually grab the hammer, and also obviously the main spur at the back here that interacts with the spring itself. So that's part number 21. So if we drift those pins out, we can take both those pieces off. Part number 49, this pin that goes through here, is quite stubborn as well, so we need to give it some persuasion. So part number 49 comes out. That's just this little pin here that holds on. Part number 11, the transfer bar for the trigger. So if you do need to remove this, part number 21, the main hammer spur, drifting out this pin, part number 58, will allow you to do that. Again, it's pretty difficult, so, and I've got no need to do it, so I'll just leave that as it is. Next, the trigger itself can be removed, so we need to punch out the retaining pins here, parts number 46 and 87. So drift them out. So that's the lower pin, part number 46, that goes all the way through. Drift that out. So part number 87 on this side as well, remove that. Okay, so with that pin drifted out, the whole trigger chassis should come loose. Take some persuasion, and be careful of this. Part number 70, that's the spring that helps retain the slide release lever on the other side. So it's all pretty mucky, unsurprisingly. So with the trigger unit out, you see it consists of part number 6, the main chassis itself, the trigger itself, part number 9, the transfer bar, this big thing here, which goes around the magazine, so that's part number 10, that transfers the action of the trigger into the sear system at the back. Part number 64 in here is the trigger return butterfly spring. The adjustment grub screw on the front here is part number 113, so you can adjust the over travel stopping point of the trigger with that. And then retainer pins, so part number 64 and part number 47. The hairpin spring here, part number 70, already dropped out. This is the bit that wraps around the other side here and helps to retain the slide stop release when it pushes through to the side. So that's the bit that causes the problem, that you have to kind of push out of the way to get the slide stop release back in when you're reassembling. So leave that to one side. If we drift those pins out, we can disassemble the whole trigger unit. So part number 45 up here, just push that to one side. So that's the main trigger axle, and you see the spring there jumps out, so be careful of that. That's the main return spring, part number 64. And then your chassis comes apart, part number 6. And we're left with the trigger itself and the trigger transfer bar. So just drift this pin out here as well. So to remove the magazine release, first we need to undo this screw, which is part number 77. Phillips head. So unscrew this from the body. And retain it, and it comes out along with this hairpin spring kind of thing here. This is the spring that resets the trigger transfer bar. It rests on both sides of that, and along with this washer. So part number 83 is the washer. Trigger transfer bar spring is part number 66. And on that same screw we have the magazine release spring. So grab some tweezers to pull that out. Okay, so there's your magazine release spring, part number 67. Last bit of the frame disassembly, we're going to take out the magazine release. On the Shadow 2, it's not one single bar, as a separate add-on piece at the top here, part number 145, which is held onto part number 20, the main release bar, by screw number 155. So we need a Torx T10 to take that out. Screw part 155 comes out. The extension plate with the grippy surface, part 145 comes out, and part 20 comes out the other side. So there's your magazine release main bar. The additional head, which you can replace with other aftermarket options if you like. That makes it easier to unload and reload. And there's the final thing, the entire frame disassembled. So the frame itself is part 1. Everything has been taken out of it now, all the springs, all the components, all the sub-assemblies. So I'm going to send this off and get it sandblasted and hard anodized in black. And then I'll reassemble the whole lot, along with some additional internal upgrades that I've gotten since. With the frame completely disassembled, we can turn our attention to the top slide. So part number 2, first remove the recoil spring, part number 72, as well as its guide rod, part number 22. So that's a bit fiddly at times. There we go. So it's non-captive. So the recoil spring itself, part 72, and its guide rod, part number 22, and there's this little collar, part number 42. So all that comes apart. Now we can remove the barrel assembly, so push it forwards and then lift it upwards and rearwards, that all comes out. So the outer barrel, part number 3, this is where it's failed twice on me before. You can see the design has changed, there's only slots on the right hand side now, which this pin rides in to give you the brownie action basically with the slide locking ribs at the top. In the first one, this was present on both sides and it basically broke in the end eventually with this pin hammering backwards and forwards using CO2 mags. The force of that basically fractured the whole back end off the barrel. In this next generation they only make it on one side, but recently I replaced the barrel again because, again, even with just one side, using CO2 mags for another competition, it fractured all the way around to the top. So I basically took out half of the barrel this time. So I've changed it and this is now the 3rd barrel in total, or the 2nd one that I've replaced that's 2nd gen, so we'll see how that lasts. So to get that out we need to get rid of this pin 53, number 53, which is the retention pin, so that comes out quite easily, and then the inner barrel can come out of the outer barrel. So the outer barrel, part number 3, put that one side. Now the inner barrel and its sub-assemblies. So to disassemble the hop further, we can start by taking out these 2 identical screws. They're both part number 53. If we remove those, we can basically separate the 2 halves of the hop unit and remove all the other bits inside. So that's the front one, again part number 53, and the back one. Halves. So you take the 2 halves of the hop unit off, parts number 16 and 17 respectively, so 16 for the left, 17 for the right. They're held together by those screws, take those apart, and now you're left with the barrel, the hop rubber, and the hop adjustment stirrup. So you can just pull the hop rubber off, and you're left with the inner barrel, part number 43, the hop rubber, part number 40, the stirrup and its adjustment screw and return spring. So the stirrup itself is part number 29, the adjustment screw is part number 18, and the return spring on the outside here is part number 93. Again, with this, it's not really worth dismantling it unless there's a problem, so I'll just leave that to one side. So to dismantle the blowback unit, we can remove the blowback unit from the slide first. So at the back, part number 76, where the firing pin would be on the reel gun, there's a retainer screw, so we can undo that with an Allen wrench, Allen key. Take that out, and you can see the blowback unit is already moving forwards. So part number 76, the screw that retains that, and then it should just be a case of lift out the blowback unit. From the slide you can see there, the return spring, part number 92, that springs out anyway, so that sits in the top there usually, acting against the track in the slide itself, so be aware that's going to fall out probably anyway. And then we're left with the blowback nozzle plastic unit, that's number 32, and the gas blowback unit itself, which is part number 15 and 109 at the bottom there. So we can pull off this, the rubber gasket, part number 41. Okay, and underneath that is the screw that retains the rubber gasket, that's part number 94, we can take that out if we need to. So just unscrew that from the blowback housing. So that's part number 94, the retaining screw. And we're left then with the blowback housing itself, which is a 2-piece thing comprised of part number 109, which snaps over at the back, this little flat shoe at the back, and the main casting itself, part number 15. Inside the nozzle, obviously there's a retainer pin. We can drift that out and get the actual nozzle valve itself out along with its spring. So the valve is part number 35, the spring is part number 75, and the pin that goes through is part number 48. Okay, so the last part of taking the top slide down, removing the rear sight, need a 1.5 Allen screw to undo these two retention screws that hold the rear sight block onto the dovetail. You can adjust the windage by loosening these ones off, which I have done in the past. Once I put it back together, I imagine I'll have to redo that because I'll lose where my position was. So these two screws, part number 156, the grub screws, come out, both of them, get the other one as well. And they are pressing down on this dovetail to help locate the rear sight block. Okay. So once part 156, both of those are out, it can take some persuasion, but that should drop off. Watch out for that spring there. Part number 144, that's the retention spring, which basically gives you the elevation adjustment on the rear flapping part of the block here. So don't lose that. Put that back in there for the moment. So the whole rear sight thing, the main block here, part 140, 140. There's this flapping part at the back, which actually gives you the elevation control. That's part 142. Part 144, as I say, is the spring that lifts it off the slide against the action of this screw, part 143, which controls the elevation adjustment. So that whole unit comes off. And underneath here is an insert plate, part number 154, which gives it a solid surface to key into with these two screws. So I'm going to leave that in there, I think. And the very last piece of the top slide disassembly is removing the front sights. So this is block part number 84. The actual fibre optic collimating sight is 84-1. And I've already removed pin 112, which is the retainer. And we just need to persuade it out of the front dovetail. There we go. So there's the finished, removed, stripped down top slide. So that is part number 2. And the last bit to come out is part number 84 with 84-1 inside it, which is the front sight blade. Okay, so that's the entire thing completely stripped down now, with the exception of the magazines. Final part of the whole disassembly process. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 magazines. They've had varying amounts of time. You can see the worst ones have almost shed all of the paintwork. Even some of the newer ones are looking pretty battered. Obviously I've been using these for a year and a half, nearly 2 years, most of them, and they've been through quite a bit. So, focus on one. Parts of the magazine. Feed lip unit at the top here is an insert, that's part number 34. Inside or underneath that is the rubber gasket shoe, that's part number 39. That channels the gas up from the valve inside into the actual operating mechanism. At the back, part number 79 is the fairly standard gas nozzle that the striker hits at the back. The magazine lips are retained by part number 57, a drift pin at the top here. The magazine follower is a single plastic unit, that's part number 36. The magazine spring, part number 81. At the bottom of the follower is part number 38. That's kind of the retainer that also holds on the base plate, which is part number 37. These have a tendency to fly off and or break when you're using them for IPSC and dropping your magazines, so you can get aftermarket ones, which we'll discuss in the next video, which are steel and retained better, but these are the standard plastic ones. They're basically the same between the SP01 and the Shadow 2. There might be a slight bit of difference in terms of the geometry and the markings, but they function the same way. And inside at the bottom we have the main base unit, part number 27, which is a casting. Part number 90 is the screw which retains the follower at the bottom there. If we take that out, it'll spring out. In the bottom is the fairly standard gas fill valve, part number 80. Inside is part number 88, the seal, which we'll get to later, and these two retention pins, part numbers 59 at the side. So, first thing to do is vent any gas. I wouldn't usually advise doing that. I'm just doing it because I've got to disassemble this. I usually leave mine gassed up completely, or at least partially. So start off with drifting out the pins at the bottom. Okay, pull them out the rest of the way. So those pins, part numbers 59, identical. Now the whole base unit comes off, so this is all one piece casting. There's your follower bottom, part number 38. There's a little dimple on here which interacts with the hole on the base plates to take them on. Sometimes when it lands that bounces up and unlatches, or it just breaks off entirely. I would probably replace these with the metal unit. The casting itself, and here we have the O-ring which seals, so part number 88. Okay, pull out the spring and the follower, so spring, part number 81, single piece plastic injection molded follower, part number 36, and all we've got left at the top end now is the valve and the feed lips. So we'll drift out the main pin there, that whole really clear. So there's your top retention pin, part number 57, that holds in the magazine feed lips. So that whole unit should come out, and there's part number 39, your rubber gasket system which channels the gas up. This brass plate does not appear to be on the numbered sheet, but it sits underneath and it gives it a bit of a flat surface and a standoff, so make sure you don't lose that. And then that's just basically the finished body, so we just need to take out the valve at the back. Excellent idea to have a proper valve key for this job. Just sits on there, so it has two tangs which line up with the slots in the back of the valve, and unscrew that. Okay, and that comes out as one piece. Okay, so you can buy replacements of these if needs be. You can buy upgrade ones. ICS make their Revo system where you can actually change the standoff of this